Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video, we're going to be talking about best practices for strengthening the gluteus medius and minimus. Now, for the most part, we're going to not really be talking about gluteus minimus. Generally speaking, the way you would strengthen that muscle is no different than how you would strengthen the gluteus medius. And so, for simplicity, I'll just be saying gluteus medius, but technically, it's really both of these. Now, in order to see the entirety of the gluteus maximus has to be reflected off. So that's what they've done in this image right here. And now we can see the entirety of the gluteus medius. The gluteus minimus is deep to that. So we can't see it here in this image, but it is underneath the gluteus medius. Now, the gluteus medius, most people don't realize this, can actually be divided into three separate zones or regions, kind of like the deltoid. The deltoid has anterior, middle, and posterior fibers. So too does the gluteus medius. All three sets of fibers facilitate hip abduction, although it is mostly coming from the middle fibers. The anterior fibers facilitate a little more hip internal rotation, and the posterior fibers facilitate a little more external rotation, but hip abduction is a function that is common to all three zones. Now, hip abduction is something that generally occurs in open kinetic chain, and you can see an exercise for this right here. This won't be the focus of the video, just like we saw for hip extension, but essentially you are in a hip-hinged stance to put the hips in a lot of flexion at the start, and then you are moving into hip abduction. Now, it's not straight hip abduction that I'm doing here. I call this 45-degree hip abduction. It's somewhere between straight abduction and straight extension, about 45 degrees backward. This is going to hit mostly the middle and posterior fibers, which I would argue are the most important ones for most people to hit. Early on, you can get some pretty good strength gains in the gluteus medius doing this type of exercise, but unfortunately, open kinetic chains kind of run their course in terms of utility. If you want to be able to load the muscle up even more, it's better to do closed kinetic chain exercises, which is what we're going to see in just a minute. In closed kinetic chain, the gluteus medius is not facilitating abduction. What it's doing, rather, is limiting the degree of hip adduction. It's preventing the hip from collapsing inward into adduction. All in all, that basically means pelvic stabilization. Pelvic stabilization is something that is necessary anytime we're either on one leg, or if we're in a split or staggered stance and most of the weight is on one foot. Let's say 80% of our weight on the front foot and only 20% on the back side. On the front side where we're 80%, you need a lot of pelvic stabilization on that side. And that's where gluteus medius and minimus also are going to kick in significantly. And when we do closed kinetic chain, because we have the help of the glute max and all sorts of other stuff, we can load a lot more weight and really challenge that pelvic stability there. Closed kinetic chain exercises are just going to be a much bigger bang for your buck for those lateral glute muscles. Now, if you think back to the previous video on the gluteus maximus, we actually saw two single leg exercises for the gluteus maximus, and those were Bulgarian split squats with a glute emphasis. You can see that one right here. You can do it in this standard means, or you can do it in a pendulum format with a TRX suspension system. Either way, great exercise for gluteus maximus. We also saw a deficit reverse lunge. Again, another single leg type of exercise, really good for gluteus maximus, but because these are single leg, on the working side, which is going to be 80-90% of our weight through that side, we need a lot of pelvic stabilization. And so those are already going to be good for gluteus medius and minimus. So we've already seen two. Now, let's take a look at four other exercises to really light up those lateral glute muscles. And we're going to start with a progression of the deficit reverse lunge, which is the deficit reverse curtsy lunge. Now, in the standard deficit reverse lunge, the rear foot just goes straight back. In the curtsy format, at the minimum, we want the rear foot to go directly behind the other foot. Okay? It doesn't necessarily have to cross on the other side of it, but at least if we get it to right behind the working side foot, that is going to be a bigger stretch on the gluteus medius on the working side, on the weight-bearing side, because we are forcing that hip to want to go into adduction, adduction. And so to control against that excessive adduction and that hip collapse, gluteus medius and minimus are going to be firing really hard. Now, the big thing that you want to make sure that you don't do is you don't want your torso to turn either direction when you are stepping down, okay, or stepping back, I should say. If you find that your torso is turning, you're getting a lot of lumbar compensation, and you might not need to either use as much weight, you might need to take away the deficit, you might consider not even stepping in as far, maybe just going a hair short of that and working up to the curtsy position. If your torso's turning, it's not coming as much from the hips, it's coming from the spine. And that's not adding any more to the gluteus medius, okay? But assuming you can do that rear foot right behind the other foot and your torso is not turning excessively, then consider bringing it back even further and crossing over to the other side, which is now what you see here. Either of these are deficit reverse curtsy lunges, but in both cases, I want to make sure that my torso is not turning excessively, because that means I'm getting lumbar compensation. And I'm not necessarily concerned about hurting the back, but it's not adding anything to the gluteus medius and minimus. But if you really want to light up those glute medius, oh my gosh, add the curtsy component and you are golden. Exercise number 2, B stance RDLs, again with a glute emphasis. So a B stance, what is that? B stance is a special case of split stance or staggered stance. So when we did a split squat in other videos, the feet were like this. Here's your working side, here's your rear foot side, okay? In B stance, the heel of the working side lines up with the toes of the rear or non-working side. And that is going to be B stance. It's just a special case of staggered or split stance, okay? And so when we do this B stance RDL, as you can see right here, again, we're trying to minimize the hamstring stretch on the working side, because if we're getting a lot of hamstring stretching under tension, we're doing more of a hamstring bias. So we want to make sure we're not feeling it as much in the hamstrings, we're feeling more of that stretch in the glute on the left side. The other thing on these B stance movements you want to make sure is when you're hinging down, there's a slight rotational component at the hips, okay? As you descend down, you want your sternum to be over the working side toes, okay? If you just hinge straight down, your sternum is going to be on the inside of the working side toes. So as you go down, you bring the sternum over, right, over those working side toes, and what that does is it positions that working side hip in a little bit of internal rotation, okay? So again, these can also be used in part to reinforce hip internal rotation mobility drills. Kind of a cool thing there. But the reason we want to put that hip into a little more internal rotation is the glute max functions a little better there. And the other thing is it requires a little more pelvic stabilization to be able to do that. So more gluteus medius, more gluteus minimus. I would venture to say that the way you know you're doing this exercise correctly is if at the bottom of that hip hinge, you feel a really strong stretch in that lateral hip area in or around the greater trochanter. Probability says you're doing the exercise correctly, okay? Progressively overload over time, great for the lateral glutes. Now you'll notice that nowhere on this list do I have a strict single leg RDL. And there's a reason for that, because a lot of people would say, oh, well, you're on one leg, so that's going to have the greatest stability demand in the frontal plane, so therefore that's the best gluteus medius exercise, and that would be flat out false. And the reason is because when you're doing a single leg RDL, there is a massive stability and balance requirement, not just at the hips, but at the ankles. And in fact, for most people, the stability and balance becomes the limiting factor, not the ability to actually move the weight. And so on a strict single leg RDL, it is much, much harder to get the appropriate stimulus needed for strengthening and or hypertrophy. But by having that little kickstand there in the back with your rear foot on the B stance RDL, you're still getting quite a bit of gluteus medius on the working side, but you have that extra stability and balance to be able to load up a lot more weight than you would on a strict single leg RDL, and therefore it's going to be easier to get that stimulus on the B stance. That's one way to get around it. The other way is to do what's called a landmine RDL. This is exercise number 3. And technically this is single leg, but you're going to be holding on to a landmine apparatus, as you can see right here. Now, the landmine apparatus, holding onto that, provides a substantial amount of stability. And so you can now go single leg on this and just load and roast your lateral glute muscles. I only recently tried this exercise. I've seen some people advertising it on social media as of late, but I never gave it a try. And I tried this one out, and oh my gosh, let me tell you, I love this one. It takes a little bit of getting used to first, finding the appropriate your stance position. But oh my gosh, I was surprised how much stability holding onto that barbell actually added. So if you're looking to do a single leg RDL and you just don't have the balance, and for whatever reason you want to do something other than the B stance RDL, definitely give this landmine apparatus a try. Absolutely toasted the lateral glute muscles, and it also gets the rear glutes as well because you're doing a hip extension based movement. But like the B stance RDL, you want to make sure that as you're descending down, hinging forward, your sternum is going over the weight bearing side toes, left side in this video, for example. The last exercise we're going to cover here, number 4, this is the B stance hip thrust. Now, you could certainly do a totally single leg hip thrust here, but the problem again is that it's single leg, you have much poorer stabilization there, and you're not going to be able to load as much weight. Whereas if I have that kickstand foot with the B stance, I can load a lot more weight, get a greater stimulus for the gluteus medius, better strength gains, better hypertrophy gains, and those things will, if I practice the movement, translate over to a totally single leg movement that I can do separately. Okay. Now, again, with hip thrusts, any kind of these, like we talked about in the previous video on the gluteus maximus, this is biomechanically different than the other glute exercises in the sense that all the other glute exercises, at the point in the movement where the glutes are on their peak stretch in their most lengthened position, we also have that point corresponding to peak tension on those muscles. And that's great from a hypertrophy standpoint. That's that stretch-mediated hypertrophy. But with any hip thrust variant, at the bottom of the movement where the hips are bent, and certainly they're not bent that much, the range of motion here is pretty low, so we're not getting a very big stretch on the glutes at all. But that limited stretch that you are getting, that's the point where the movement's the easiest. At the top, the peak squeeze, where the glutes are shortened, both maximus and medius, that's where it's the hardest. So we're not optimizing that point of peak tension as also corresponding to the point of peak stretch. So this is not going to operate through a stretch-mediated hypertrophy mechanism at all. Instead, if we load a lot of weight and we do a lot of repetitions and we make sure also to do both sides, right, left and right, we can put a lot of mechanical tension through the glutes, both maximus and medius. Now, the reason you would do the standard hip thrust, where both feet are even, is to really hit more gluteus maximus. That's going to be a more stable exercise. But if we do this B stance, we can really load the gluteus medius on the weight-bearing side. And we're going to be able to load it, like I said, a lot more and put a lot more mechanical tension through it than we could if we were doing this as a totally single leg exercise. Okay, so I would say that for most people who are doing hip thrusts, this B stance is going to be a much bigger bang for your buck than going totally single leg. But understand the purpose of each. B stance is more for gluteus medius. The bilateral even stance or standard stance, that is for gluteus maximus. But you are getting some of both in each exercise. So that is the B stance hip thrust. And hopefully this video gave you a really good understanding of these exercises and a good toolbox of what you can use to target the gluteus maximus and medius, both in your own workouts and in a clinical setting. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.